Margaret had been walking the same dusty road for 3 days now, and her feet ached something fierce in those old leather boots that had seen better years, much like herself. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on her graying hair as she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to remember why she had thought this journey was such a good idea in the first place. She was 62 years old and had been a widow for nearly 5 years since Harold passed, and Lord knows she had grown tired of sitting in that empty house listening to the grandfather clock tick away the hours like a heartbeat that refused to stop. So when she received that letter from her sister Ruth saying there was work available at the trading post 2 towns over, Margaret had packed what little she owned into a canvas satchel and started walking. The road stretched endlessly before her through this godforsaken stretch of desert between Millfield and Carson Creek, and she was beginning to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake when she heard the most pitiful moaning coming from behind a cluster of rocks just off the main path. Her motherly instincts kicked in immediately despite her exhaustion, and she found herself leaving the safety of the road to investigate the sound. What she discovered there in the shade of those weathered stones made her gasp and take several steps backward. A man lay crumpled on the ground, his face completely covered by what appeared to be a burlap sack tied roughly around his head with coarse rope, and his clothes were torn and bloodied from what looked like a terrible beating. His hands were bound behind his back and he was trying desperately to speak through the rough fabric that covered his mouth, but the words came out muffled and unclear. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her heart racing as she tried to decide what to do, because Harold had always warned her about helping strangers, especially in remote places like this. But then the man managed to work his face against the ground enough to push the sack up slightly, and she heard him say as clear as day through gritted teeth, "You save me and you will regret it, lady." Those words should have sent her running back to the road as fast as her tired legs could carry her, but something in his voice, something broken and desperate, made her stay. Maybe it was because she recognized that particular kind of pain, the kind that comes from losing everything that matters and having nowhere left to turn. Margaret had felt that same desperation herself during those first months after Harold died, when the bank threatened to take their little house and she had no idea how she would survive. So instead of walking away, she found herself kneeling down beside this mysterious stranger and working at the knots that held the sack over his head. The rope was tied tight and her arthritis made her fingers stiff and clumsy, but she persevered even as the man continued to warn her through the fabric. "Do not do this," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You do not know who I am or what I have done. Walk away from here and pretend you never saw me." But Margaret had never been one to abandon someone in need, and she certainly was not going to start now, regardless of what this poor soul thought he had done to deserve such treatment. When she finally managed to pull the sack away from his head, she found herself looking into the most haunting pair of brown eyes she had ever seen. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and a face that had obviously seen more than its share of hardship and violence. There were fresh bruises along his jaw and a cut above his left eyebrow that was still bleeding, but what struck Margaret most was the look of complete resignation in those eyes, as if he had already given up on everything, including his own life. "My name is Thomas," he said quietly once she had freed his hands as well and helped him sit up against the rocks. "Thomas Garrett, and I want you to know before you do anything else that the men who did this to me were right to do it." Margaret handed him her water canteen and watched as he drank deeply before continuing. "I am not a good man, Mrs. I have done terrible things and hurt people who trusted me, and if you help me now you will be putting yourself in danger, because those men will come looking for me." She studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception, but all she saw was genuine remorse and a bone-deep weariness that reminded her of how she had felt during those darkest days after Harold died. "What kind of terrible things?" she asked gently. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert horizon before he finally answered. "I was a gambler and a cheat, and when I ran out of money I started stealing from the people who employed me. Last week I took $300 from the bank where I worked and tried to run away to California, but they caught me just outside of town." He gestured weakly toward his battered face and torn clothes. "This was their idea of frontier justice before they decided to leave me out here to die." Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy, because she knew what it was like to make desperate choices when you felt like you had no other options. After Harold passed, she had seriously considered selling their wedding ring to pay for groceries until Mrs. Henderson from the church had quietly left a basket of food on her doorstep. That small act of kindness had saved her pride and possibly her life, and now she found herself in a position to offer the same grace to someone else. Well, Thomas Garrett, she said firmly as she helped him to his feet. I may be just a foolish old widow woman, but I believe everyone deserves a second chance at making things right. He tried to protest, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. My late husband Harold used to say that a person is not defined by their worst moment but by what they choose to do after that moment has passed. Now you can either come with me to Carson Creek where my sister Ruth runs a trading post, or you can stay here and let the desert vultures finish what those men started. The choice is yours, but I am not leaving you here to die. Thomas stared at her for a long moment as if trying to understand why this stranger would risk everything to help someone like him. Finally he nodded slowly and allowed her to help him gather his strength for the journey ahead. They walked together in companionable silence for the rest of that day, with Margaret sharing her small supply of food and water while Thomas told her more about his life and the choices that had led him to that desperate moment in the desert. He had grown up in a good family with parents who loved him and had taught him right from wrong, but after his father died in a mining accident when Thomas was just 20, he had started gambling as a way to deal with his grief and anger. One bad decision led to another until he found himself trapped in a cycle of debt and deception that eventually cost him everything, including the respect of his remaining family and friends. By the time they reached Carson Creek 2 days later, Margaret had come to understand that Thomas was not an evil man but rather someone who had lost his way and was desperately trying to find a path back to the person he used to be. Ruth took one look at her sister arriving with this battered stranger and immediately began fussing over both of them with hot soup and clean bandages and a dozen questions about what in the world Margaret thought she was doing. But when Margaret explained the situation, Ruth simply nodded and told Thomas he could work in their stable and sleep in the small room above it until he figured out what he wanted to do next. The only condition was that he help her elderly customers with their heavy packages and treat everyone with respect regardless of how they treated him. Thomas accepted this arrangement gratefully, and for the next several weeks he proved himself to be a reliable and hard-working employee who went out of his way to be helpful to everyone who came through the trading post. Margaret watched him carefully during this time, looking for signs that he might revert to his old ways, but instead she saw a man who was genuinely trying to rebuild his life one small act of kindness at a time. He was especially gentle with the older customers, helping them load their supplies and always making sure they had everything they needed before they started their journey home. One afternoon, an elderly rancher named William Patterson came into the store looking for someone to help him drive his cattle to market because his regular hands had all quit after a dispute over wages. Ruth suggested Thomas for the job even though she knew it would mean losing a good employee, and Margaret held her breath wondering if Thomas would take this opportunity to disappear with whatever money he could lay his hands on. Instead, Thomas looked the rancher straight in the eye and said, "Mr. Patterson, I need to tell you something about myself before you decide whether to trust me with this job." He then proceeded to explain his entire history, including the stealing and the beating and the fact that he was still technically a wanted man in the next county. William Patterson listened to this confession without saying a word, and when Thomas finished, the old rancher was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke. "Son," he said slowly, "I have been raising cattle for 40 years and I have learned that a man who tells you his worst mistakes up front is probably someone you can trust with your best horses. The job is yours if you want it." Thomas worked for Mr. Patterson for the rest of that summer, and when he returned to Carson Creek in the fall, he had enough money saved to pay back every penny he had stolen from the bank plus interest. He also had a letter of recommendation from the rancher praising his honesty and work ethic and an offer to become a permanent partner in the cattle business. That evening, as Margaret sat on the porch of Ruth Trading Post watching the sun set over the desert, she reflected on how much both their lives had changed since that day she found Thomas behind those rocks. He had proven that people really could change when they were given the chance and the support they needed to make better choices. And she had learned that sometimes the best way to heal your own broken heart is to help someone else repair theirs. Thomas came out to join her on the porch carrying 2 cups of Ruth famous coffee, and they sat together in comfortable silence watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "You know," he said eventually, "I still do not understand why you helped me that day. You could have just kept walking and saved yourself a lot of trouble and worry." Margaret smiled and reached over to pat his arm gently. "Thomas," she said, "when Harold died I thought my life was over and that I had nothing left to offer the world. But helping you reminded me that we all have something valuable to give even when we feel like we have lost everything. Sometimes that something is just the willingness to see the good in another person when they cannot see it in themselves. They continued to sit there under the vast canopy of desert stars, both of them grateful for the unexpected friendship that had grown from that moment of crisis in the wilderness. Thomas eventually did become Mr. Patterson's partner and built a successful life for himself based on honesty and hard work. He never forgot the lesson Margaret taught him about second chances, and he made it his mission to help other people who had lost their way just as she had helped him. Margaret stayed in Carson Creek and became like a mother to half the town, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand for anyone who needed it. Years later, when people asked her about that dusty day when she found a beaten stranger in the desert, she would just smile and say that sometimes the greatest risks we take are the ones that teach us the most about who we really are. And sometimes the people who warn us away from them are exactly the ones who need our help the most. The desert had taught them both that redemption is always possible when it is offered with an open heart and accepted with genuine gratitude. Their story became a quiet legend in that part of the country, a reminder that kindness is never wasted even when it seems foolish or dangerous. Because in the end we are all just travelers on the same dusty road looking for someone to believe in us when we have stopped believing in ourselves.